Welcome to Big Pool Discipleship 101, the Bible in a Year, Week 47, Acts 16 through 28, and Romans 1 through 7, From Timothy to O Wretched Man. In Acts 16, why did Paul circumcise Timothy, even though it was no longer necessary? In verse 7, how would the disciples know that the Holy Spirit did not permit them to go to Bithynia? Who was Lydia? What was a spirit of divination? The Greek phrase is literally a spirit of Python, a mythical snake, and the implication from the passage is that she was involved with evil spirits. What happened after they were beaten and jailed? What remarkable thing was said in verse 31? In Acts 17, what day did Paul preach to the Jews 3 times? Seventh-day Adventists and other Sabbatarians use this verse to prove Sabbath-keeping for Christians. But that is the letter, and Christians keep the spirit of the law. Is mandating Sunday rest just as much of the letter? What accusation was made against Christians in verse 6? What commendable quality did the Bereans exhibit in verse 11? Beginning in verse 22, what did Paul say to the men of Athens? In verse 26, who has determined every nation's pre-appointed times and boundaries? What does verse 28 mean? In him we live and move and have our being. In Acts 18, what occupation did Paul have? In verses 9 and 10, what dream did Paul have? What did he do about it? What kind of preaching did Apollos do in verse 28? In Acts 19, what 2 baptisms are mentioned in verses 4 and 5? In verses 11 and 12, what special miracles did God work by the hands of Paul? In verses 9 and 23, what was Christianity called at that time? What was the cause of the riot at Ephesus? In Acts 20, where is Macedonia? In verse 7, on what day of the week did they break bread? In verses 21 and 24 to 25, what was Paul's message? In verses 29 and 30, what was his warning? What do we learn in verse 35? In Acts 21, what was the warning to Paul in verse 4? What was the prophecy in verses 10 and 11? What was Paul's answer in verse 13? To whom did Paul report in Jerusalem? What happened to Paul? In Acts 22, what was Paul's testimony to the crowd? What citizenship did he claim? In Acts 23:11, what did God tell Paul? What plot did Paul's nephew reveal? In Acts 24:27, how many years was Paul imprisoned? In Acts 25:11 and 12, to whom did Paul appeal? In Acts 26, what did Paul preach? What did Agrippa say to Paul in verse 28? In Acts 27, on his way to Rome, what was Paul's warning to the ship's captain in verse 10? What did the angel say to Paul in verse 24? Where were they shipwrecked? What prophecy did Acts 28, 3 through 5 fulfill? See Mark 16, verse 18. What was Paul's ministry in Malta? What was his ministry in Rome? Verse 31. Paul wrote the letter to the Romans to explain the gospel. It's a challenge and a theological masterpiece. In Romans 1:7, what does Paul say we are called to be? In verse 9, what did he say about his prayers? What does verse 17 say how we are to live? What do verses 24 through 32 say happens when people exchange the truth of God for a lie? What does Romans 2 verse 1 say ought to be our approach to such people? What does verse 4 say? What questions ought to we ask ourselves in verses 22 and 23? What do verses 25 through 29 say is true circumcision? What does Romans 3 verses 10 through 18 say is the state of all of us? How do verses 23 through 26 summarize this? Can any of us who may not engage in certain sins really boast? In Romans 4, how was Abraham justified? What do verses 7 and 8 say? Was Abraham circumcised when he showed such faith? Verse 12. In Romans 5:1, are we justified by sinless perfection or by faith? For whom did Christ die? Verse 6. What verse best summarizes the discussion of sin and grace in verses 12 through 21? In Romans 6:1, does grace allow us to continue in sin? In verse 12, what should we not let reign? What are the wages of sin in verse 23? What is the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter in verse 6? If the law is holy, just, and good, what is the problem? Verse 14. What humility ought Christians to have, according to verses 13 to 25? How do the words, O wretched man, and the rest of verse 24 compare to self-righteous and judgmental Christians? The answer is not to exchange the truth of God with a lie by denying what is sin, but to realize that we're all sinners whose only hope is faith in God's grace. Well, that's it for this time. Until next time, God bless you.